back, everyone. Thank you so much, Bruno. It really is an honor to be back on the TED stage. Now, many of us grew up in the 1990s in the last decade watching sci-fi movies. Who can forget the most famous line Keanu Reeves ever uttered? Whoa. Well, thanks to Jason Silva, we now have a far more enlightened syllable to express our awe. Wow. And that, my friends, is definitive proof that we do indeed have cultural evolution. So thank you, Jason Silva, for your video on Tuesday morning. Now, the last 2.5 days have been an amazing exploration of the nature of radical openness. And now we're going to take a magnifying glass and explore its consequences, specifically its political consequences. Transparency. Transparency is at once the most powerful, the most dangerous, and the most incomplete political ideal of the 21st century. Transparency is the embodiment of the phrase, knowledge is power. Transparency is the lever by which openness becomes change. Transparency disrupts authority all over the world. Democracies, non-democracies, public and private. But are all of those changes and disruptions good? Are they all desirable? What happens when all of us have access to connective technologies? What happens when all of us live in glass houses? Are we going to use that transparency and harness it to enhance our society? Or are we going to use it against each other? Those are some of the questions that we're going to explore in this session as we seek the upside of transparency. Now, banks are usually the last place you look for transparency. But one bank is different. It's the World Bank. And its vice president, Sanjay Pradhan, is our first speaker. And you'll find that his story is not only one of changing the policies of some of the world's most powerful governments and international organizations. It's also the story of a father and son. Sanjay Pradhan.
Hi. I grew up in Bihar, India's poorest state. And I remember when I was 6 years old, I remember coming home one day to find a cart full of the most delicious sweets at our doorstep. My brothers and I dug in, and that's when my father came home. He was livid, and I still remember how we cried when that cart with our half-eaten sweets was pulled away from us. Later, I understood why my father got so upset. Those sweets were a bribe from a contractor who was trying to get my father to award him a government contract. My father was responsible for building roads in Bihar. And he had developed a firm stance against corruption, even though he was harassed and threatened. His was a lonely struggle, because Bihar was also India's most corrupt state, where public officials were enriching themselves than serving the poor, who had no means to express their anguish if their children had no food or no schooling. And I experienced this most viscerally when I traveled to remote villages to study poverty. And as I went village to village, I remember one day when I was famished and exhausted, and I was almost collapsing in a scorching heat under a tree. And just at that time, one of the poorest men in that village invited me into his hut and graciously fed me. Only I later realized that what he fed me was food for his entire family for 2 days. This profound gift of generosity challenged and changed the very purpose of my life. I resolved to give back. Later, I joined the World Bank, which sought to fight such poverty by transferring aid from rich to poor countries. My initial work focused on Uganda, where I focused on negotiating reforms with the finance ministry of Uganda so they could access our loans. But after we dispersed the loans, I remember a trip in Uganda where I found newly built schools without textbooks or teachers, new health clinics without drugs, and the poor, once again, without any voice or recourse. It was Bihar all over again. Bihar represents the challenge of development, abject poverty surrounded by corruption. Globally, 1.3 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day. And the work I did in Uganda represents the traditional approach to these problems that has been practiced since 1944, when winners of World War II, 500 founding fathers and one lonely founding mother, you can't spot her in the picture, gathered in New Hampshire, USA, to establish the Bretton Woods institutions, including the World Bank. And that traditional approach to development had 3 key elements. First, transfer of resources from rich countries in the north to poorer countries in the south, accompanied by reform prescriptions. Second, the development institutions that channeled these transfers were opaque, with little transparency of what they financed or what results they achieved. And third, the engagement in developing countries was with a narrow set of government elites, with little interaction with the citizens who are the ultimate beneficiaries of development assistance. Today, each of these elements is opening up due to dramatic changes in the global environment, open knowledge, open aid, open governance. And together, they represent 3 key shifts that are transforming development and that also hold greater hope for the problems I witnessed in Uganda and in Bihar. The first key shift is open knowledge. You know, developing countries today will not simply accept solutions that are handed down to them by the US, Europe, or the World Bank. They get their inspiration, their hope, their practical know-how from successful emerging economies in the South. They want to know how China lifted 500 million people out of poverty in 30 years. How Mexico's Oportunidades program improved schooling and nutrition for millions of children. This is the new ecosystem of open knowledge flows, not just traveling north to south, but south to south, and even south to north, with Mexico's Oportunidades today inspiring New York City. And just as these north to south transfers are opening up, so too are the development institutions that channeled these transfers. This is the second shift, open aid. Recently, the World Bank opened its vault of data for public use, releasing 8,000 economic and social indicators for 200 countries over 50 years. And it launched a global competition to crowdsource innovative apps using this data. Development institutions today are also opening for public scrutiny the projects they finance. Take geomapping. In this map from Kenya, the red dots show where all the schools financed by donors are located. And the darker the shade of green, the more the number of out-of-school children. So this simple mashup reveals that donors have not financed any schools in the areas with the most out-of-school children, provoking new questions. Is development assistance targeting those who most need our help? In this manner, the World Bank has now geomapped 30,000 project activities in 143 countries, and donors are using a common platform to map all their projects. This is a tremendous leap forward in transparency and accountability of aid. And this leads me to the third, and in my view, the most significant shift in development: open governance. Governments today are opening up, just as citizens are demanding voice and accountability. From the Arab Spring to the Anna Hazare movement in India, using mobile phones and social media, not just for political accountability, but also for development accountability. Are governments delivering services to the citizens? So, for instance, several governments in Africa and Eastern Europe are opening their budgets to the public. But you know, there is a big difference between a budget that's public and a budget that's accessible. This is a public budget. And as you can see, it's not really accessible or understandable to an ordinary citizen that is trying to understand how the government is spending its resources. To tackle this problem, governments are using new tools to visualize the budget, so it's more understandable to the public. In this map from Moldova, the green color shows those districts that have low spending on schools, but good educational outcomes, and the red color shows the opposite. Tools like this help turn a shelf full of inscrutable documents into a publicly understandable visual. And what's exciting is that with this openness, there are today new opportunities for citizens to give feedback and engage with government. So in the Philippines today, parents and students can give real-time feedback on a website, checkmyschool.org, or using SMS, where the teachers and textbooks are showing up in school. The same problems I witnessed in Uganda and in Bihar. And the government is responsive. So for instance, when it was reported on this website that 800 students were at risk because school repairs had stalled due to corruption, the Department of Education in the Philippines took swift action. And you know what's exciting is that this innovation is now spreading south to south, from the Philippines to Indonesia, Kenya, Moldova, and beyond. In Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, even an impoverished community was able to use these tools to voice its aspirations. This is what the map of Tandale looked like in August 2011. But within a few weeks, university students were able to use mobile phones and an open source platform to dramatically map the entire community infrastructure. And what is very exciting is that citizens were then able to give feedback as to which health or water points were not working, aggregated in the red bubbles that you see, which together provides a graphic visual of the collective voices of the poor. Today, even Bihar is turning around and opening up under a committed leadership that is making government transparent, accessible, and responsive to the poor. But you know, in many parts of the world, governments are not interested in opening up or in serving the poor. And it is a real challenge for those who want to change the system. These are the lonely warriors like my father and many, many others. And a key frontier of development work is to help these lonely warriors join hands so they can together overcome the odds. So for instance, today in Ghana, courageous reformers from civil society, parliament, and government have forged a coalition for transparent contracts in the oil sector. And galvanized by this, reformers in parliament are now investigating dubious contracts. These examples give new hope, new possibility to the problems I witnessed in Uganda or that my father confronted in Bihar. 2 years ago, on April 8, 2010, I called my father. It was very late at night, and at age 80, he was typing a 70-page public interest litigation against corruption in a road project. Though he was no lawyer, he argued the case in court himself the next day. He won the ruling, but later that very evening, he fell and he died. He fought till the end, increasingly passionate that to combat corruption and poverty, not only did government officials need to be honest, but citizens needed to join together to make their voices heard. These became the two bookends of his life, and the journey he traveled in between mirrored the changing development landscape. Today, I'm inspired by these changes, and I'm excited that at the World Bank, we are embracing these new directions, a significant departure from my work in Uganda 20 years ago. We need to radically open up development so knowledge flows in multiple directions, inspiring practitioners, so aid becomes transparent, accountable, and effective. So governments open up and citizens are engaged and empowered with reformers in government. We need to accelerate these shifts. If we do, we will find that the collective voices of the poor will be heard in Bihar, in Uganda, and beyond. We will find that textbooks and teachers will show up in schools for their children. We will find that these children, too, have a real chance of breaking their way out of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sanjay. It's a perfect segue to our next speaker, Beth Noveck. As Sanjay said, citizens around the world are demanding transparency, accountability, and voice. What happens when they get it? Beth Noveck is a leading expert and practitioner of opening up governments around the world. She's going to tell us not only what open government looks like, but what it means for you. Beth Noveck.
Hi. So when the White House was built in the early 19th century, it was an open house. Neighbors came and went. Under President Adams, a local dentist happened by. He wanted to shake the president's hand. The president dismissed the Secretary of State, whom he was conferring with, and asked the dentist if he would remove a tooth. Later in the 1850s, under President Pierce, he was known to have remarked, probably the only thing he's known for, when a neighbor passed by and said, "I'd love to see the beautiful house." And Pierce said to him, "Why, my dear sir, of course you may come in. This isn't my house, it is the people's house." Well, when I got to the White House in the beginning of 2009, at the start of the Obama administration, the White House, like your government's capital, was anything but open. Bomb blast curtains covered my windows. We were running Windows 2000. Social media were blocked at the firewall. We didn't have a blog, let alone a dozen Twitter accounts like we have today. I came in to become the head of open government, to take the values and the practices of transparency, participation, and collaboration, and instill them into the way that we work, to open up government, to work with people. Now, one of the things that we know is that companies are very good at getting people to work together in teams and in networks to make very complex products, like cars and computers. And the more complex the products are a society creates, the more successful the society is over time. Companies make goods, but governments, they make public goods. They work on the cure for cancer and educating our children and making roads, but we don't have institutions that are particularly good at this kind of complexity. We don't have institutions that are good at bringing our talents to bear, at working with us in this kind of open and collaborative way. So when we wanted to create our open government policy, what did we do? We wanted naturally to ask public sector employees how we should open up government. Turns out that had never been done before. We wanted to ask members of the public to help us come up with a policy, not after the fact, commenting on a rule after it's written, the way is typically the case, but in advance. There was no legal precedent, no cultural precedent, no technical way of doing this. In fact, many people told us it was illegal. Here's the crux of the obstacle. Governments exist to channel the flow of two things, really values and expertise, to and from government and to and from citizens to the end of making decisions. But the way that our institutions are designed in our rather 18th century centralized model is to channel the flow of values through voting. Once every 4 years, once every 2 years, at best once a year. This is a rather anemic and thin way in this era of social media for us to actually express our values. Today we have technology that lets us express ourselves a great deal, perhaps a little too much. Then in the 19th century, we layer on the concept of bureaucracy and the administrative state to help us govern complex and large societies. But we've centralized these bureaucracies, we've entrenched them, and we know that the smartest person always works for someone else. We need only look around this room to know that expertise and intelligence is widely distributed in society and not limited simply to our institutions. Scientists have been studying in recent years the phenomenon that they often describe as flow, that the design of our systems, whether natural or social, channel the flow of whatever runs through them. So a river is designed to channel the flow of water. And a cloud, the lightning bolt that comes out of a cloud, channels the flow of electricity. And a leaf is designed to channel the flow of nutrients to the tree, sometimes even having to route around an obstacle, but to get that nutrition flowing. The same can be said for our social systems, for our systems of government, or at the very least, flow offers us a helpful metaphor for understanding what the problem is, what's really broken, and the urgent need that we have, that we all feel today, to redesign the flow of our institutions. We live in a Cambrian era of big data, of social networks, and we have this opportunity to redesign these institutions that are actually quite recent. Think about it. What other business do you know, what other sector of the economy, and especially one as big as the public sector, that doesn't seek to reinvent its business model on a regular basis? Sure, we invest plenty in innovation, we invest in broadband and science education and science grants, but we invest far too little in reinventing and redesigning the institutions that we have. Now, it's very easy to complain, of course, about partisan politics and entrenched bureaucracy, and we love to complain about government. It's a perennial pastime, especially around election time. But the world is complex. We soon will have 10 billion people, many of whom will lack basic resources. So complain as we might, what actually can replace what we have today? What comes the day after the Arab Spring? Well, one attractive alternative that obviously presents itself to us is that of networks, right? Networks like Facebook and Twitter, they're lean, they're mean. You've got 3,000 employees at Facebook governing 900 million inhabitants. We might even call them citizens because they've recently risen up to fight against legislative incursion. And the citizens of these networks work together to serve each other in great ways. But private communities, private corporate privatizing communities are not bottom-up democracies. They cannot replace government. Friending someone on Facebook is not complex enough to do the hard work of you and I collaborating with each other in doing the hard work of governance. But social media do teach us something. Why is Twitter so successful? Because it opens up its platform. It opens up the API to allow hundreds of thousands of new applications to be built on top of it so that we can read and process information in new and exciting ways. We need to think about how to open up the API of government. And the way that we're going to do that, I would argue, the next great superpower is going to be the one who can successfully combine the hierarchy of institution, because we have to maintain those public values, we have to coordinate the flow, but with the diversity and the pulsating life and the chaos and the excitement of networks, all of us working together to build these new innovations on top of our institutions to engage in the practice of governance. We have a precedent for this. Good old Henry II here in the 12th century invented the jury. Powerful, practical, palpable model for handing power from government to citizens. Today, we have the opportunity and we have the imperative to create thousands of new ways of interconnecting between networks and institutions, thousands of new kinds of juries, the citizen jury, the carrot mob, the hackathon. We are just beginning to invent the models by which we can co-create the process of governance. Now, we don't fully have a picture of what this will look like yet, but we're seeing pockets of evolution emerging all around us. Maybe not even evolution, I'd even start to call it a revolution in the way that we govern. Some of it's very high-tech, and some of it is extremely low-tech, such as the project that MKSS is running in Rajasthan, India, where they take the spending data of the state and paint it on 100,000 village walls, and then invite the villagers to come and comment who is on the government payroll, who's actually died, what are the bridges that have been built to nowhere, and to work together through civic engagement to save real money and participate and have access to that budget. But it's not just about policing government, it's also about creating government. Spacehive in the UK is engaging in crowdfunding, getting you and me to raise the money to build the goalposts and the park benches that will actually allow us to deliver better services in our communities. No one is better at this activity of actually getting us to engage in delivering services, sometimes where none exist, than Ushahidi. Created after the post-election riots in Kenya in 2008, this crisis mapping website and community is actually able to crowdsource the delivery of and target the delivery of better rescue services to people trapped under the rubble, whether it's after the earthquakes in Haiti or more recently in Italy. And the Red Cross, too, is training volunteers, and Twitter is certifying them, not simply to supplement existing government institutions, but in many cases to replace them. Now, what we're seeing lots of examples of, obviously, is the opening up of government data. Not enough examples of this yet, but we're starting to see this practice of people creating and generating innovative applications on top of government data. There's so many examples I could have picked, and I had almost at random selected this one of John Bon Jovi, who some of you may or may not know that he runs a soup kitchen in New Jersey, where he caters to and serves the homeless, and particularly homeless veterans. In February, he approached the White House and said, I would like to fund a prize to create scalable national applications, apps that will help not only the homeless, but those who deliver services them to do so better. February of 2002, he approaches the White House. February 2012 to June of 2012, the finalists are announced in the competition. Can you imagine in the bureaucratic world of yesteryear getting anything done in a 4-month period of time? You can barely fill out the forms in that amount of time, let alone generate real palpable innovations that improve people's lives. And I want to be clear to mention that this open government revolution is not about privatizing government. Because in many cases, what it can do when we have the will to do so is to deliver more progressive and better policy than the regulations and the legislative and litigation-oriented strategies by which we make policy today. In the state of Texas, they regulate 515 professions, from well driller to florist. Now, you can carry a gun into a church in Dallas, but do not make a flower arrangement without a license, because that will land you in jail. So what is Texas doing? They're asking you and me, using online policy wikis, to help not simply get rid of burdensome regulations that impede entrepreneurship, but to replace those regulations with more innovative alternatives, sometimes using transparency in the creation of new iPhone apps that will allow us both to protect consumers and the public and to encourage economic development. That, as it turns out, is a nice sideline of open government. It's not only the benefits that we've talked about with regard to development, it's the economic benefits and the job creation that's coming from this open innovation work. Sberbank, the largest and oldest bank in Russia, largely owned by the Russian government, has started practicing crowdsourcing, engaging its employees and citizens and the public in developing innovations. Last year, they saved $1 billion, 30 billion rubles from open innovation, and they're pushing radically the extension of crowdsourcing not only from banking, but into the public sector. And we see lots of examples of these innovators using open government data, not simply to make apps, but then to make companies and to hire people to build them working with the government. So a lot of these innovations are local. In San Ramon, California, they've published an iPhone app in which they allow you or me to say we are certified CPR trained. And then when someone has a heart attack, a notification goes out so that you can rush over to the person over here and deliver CPR. The victim who receives bystander CPR is more than twice as likely to survive. There is a hero in all of us, is their slogan. But it's not limited to the local. British Columbia, Canada, is publishing a catalog of all the ways that its residents and citizens can engage with the state in the co-creation of governance. Let me be very clear, and perhaps controversial, that open government is not about transparent government. Simply throwing data over the transom doesn't change how government works. It doesn't get anybody to do anything with that data to change lives, to solve problems, and it doesn't change government. What it does is it creates an adversarial relationship between civil society and government over the control and ownership of information. And transparency by itself is not reducing the flow of money into politics, and arguably it's not even producing accountability as well as it might if we took the next step of combining participation and collaboration with transparency to transform how we work. We're going to see this evolution really in two phases, I think. The first phase of the open government revolution is delivering better information from the crowd into the center. Starting in 2005, and this is how this open government work in the US really got started, I was teaching a patent law class to my students and explaining to them how a single person in the bureaucracy has the power to make a decision about which patent application becomes the next patent, and therefore monopolizes for 20 years the rights over an entire field of inventive activity. Well, what did we do? We said we can make a website, we can make an expert network, a social network that would connect the network to the institution to allow scientists and technologists to get better information to the patent office to aid in making those decisions. We piloted the work in the US and the UK and Japan and Australia, and now I'm pleased to report that the United States Patent Office will be rolling out universal, complete, and total openness so that all patent applications will now be open for citizen participation beginning this year. The second phase of this evolution, they deserve a hand. First phase is in getting better information in. The second phase is in getting decision-making power out. Participatory budgeting has long been practiced in Porto Alegre, Brazil. They're just starting it in the 49th Ward in Chicago. Russia is using wikis to get citizens writing law together, as is Lithuania. When we start to cede power over the core functions of government, spending, legislation, decision-making, then we're well on our way to an open government revolution. There are many things that we can do to get us there. Obviously, opening up the data is one. But the important thing is to create and curate lots more participatory opportunities. Hackathons and mashathons and working with data to build apps is an intelligible way for people to engage and participate, like the jury is. But we're going to need lots more things like it. And that's why we need to start with our youngest people. We've heard talk here at TED about people biohacking and hacking their plants with Arduino, and Mozilla is doing work around the world and getting young people to build websites and make videos. When we start by teaching young people that we live not in a passive society, a read-only society, but in a writable society where we have the power to change our communities, to change our institutions, that's when we begin to really put ourselves on the pathway towards this open government innovation, towards this open government movement, towards this open government revolution. So let me close by saying that I think the last thing, the important thing for us to do is to talk about and demand this revolution. We don't have a great way, we don't have words really to describe it yet. Words like equality and fairness and the traditional elections, democracy, these are not really great terms yet. They're not fun enough. They're not exciting enough to get us engaged in this tremendous opportunity that awaits us. But I would argue that if we want to see the kinds of innovations, the hopeful and exciting innovations that we hear talked about here at TED, in clean energy, in clean education, in development, if we want to see those adopted and we want to see those scaled, we want to see them become the governance of tomorrow, then we must all participate. Then we must get involved. We must open up our institutions. And like the leaf, we must let the nutrients flow throughout our body politic, throughout our culture, to create open institutions, to create a stronger democracy, a better tomorrow. Thank you. Pass it off? We're going in? Okay.
Thank you, Beth. I think we're starting to see that more accountable governance doesn't just emerge. It has to be fought for. Our next speaker, Heather Brooke, is one such crusader for accountability. But she raises very painful questions about who gets to claim the mantle of authority. And as we'll learn in her talk, sometimes it's hard to distinguish the heroes from the villains. Heather Brooke.
Hello, everybody. Well, it's afternoon, and it's not nap time, but it is story time. Once upon a time, the world was a big, dysfunctional family. It was run by the great and powerful parents. And the people were helpless and hopeless, naughty children. If any of the more rowdier children questioned the authority of the parents, they were scolded. If they went exploring into the parents' rooms, or even into the secret filing cabinets, they were punished and told that for their own good, they must never go in there again. Then one day, a man came to town with boxes and boxes of secret documents stolen from the parents' rooms. "Look what they've been hiding from you," he said. The children looked and were amazed. There were maps and minutes from meetings where the parents were slagging each other off. They behaved just like the children. And they made mistakes too, just like the children. The only difference was their mistakes were in the secret filing cabinets. Well, there was a girl in the town, and she didn't think they should be in the secret filing cabinets. Or if they were, there ought to be a law to allow the children access. And so she set about to make it so. Well, I'm the girl in that story, and the secret documents that I was interested in were located in this building, the British Parliament. And the data that I wanted to get my hands on were the expense receipts of members of Parliament. I thought this was a basic question to ask in a democracy. It wasn't like I was asking for the code to a nuclear bunker or anything like that. But the amount of resistance I got from this Freedom of Information request, you would have thought I'd asked something like this. So I fought for about 5 years doing this, and it was one of many hundreds of requests that I made. I didn't set out, honestly, to revolutionize the British Parliament. That was not my intention. I was just making these requests as part of research for my first book. But it ended up in this very long, protracted legal battle, and there I was, after 5 years, fighting against Parliament, in front of 3 of Britain's most eminent High Court judges, waiting for their ruling about whether or not Parliament had to release this data. And I've got to tell you, I wasn't that hopeful, because I'd seen the establishment, I thought, it always sticks together, I am out of luck. Well, guess what? I won, hooray! Well, that's not exactly the story, because the problem was that Parliament delayed and delayed releasing that data. And then they tried to retrospectively change the law so that it would no longer apply to them. The transparency law they'd passed earlier that applied to everybody else. They tried to keep it so it didn't apply to them. What they hadn't counted on was digitization, because that meant that all those paper receipts had been scanned in electronically, and it was very easy for somebody to just copy that entire database, put it on a disk, and then just saunter outside of Parliament, which they did. And then they shopped that disk to the highest bidder, which was the Daily Telegraph. And then you all remember there was weeks and weeks of revelations, everything from porn movies and bath plugs and new kitchens and mortgages that had never been paid off. The end result was 6 ministers resigned. The first Speaker of the House in 300 years was forced to resign. A new government was elected on a mandate of transparency. 120 MPs stepped down at that election. And so far, 4 MPs and 2 Lords have done jail time for fraud. So, thank you. Well, I tell you that story because it wasn't unique to Britain. It was an example of a culture clash that's happening all over the world between bewigged and bestockinged officials who think that they can rule over us without very much prying from the public, and then suddenly confronted with a public who is no longer content with that arrangement. And not only not content with it, now more often armed with official data itself. So we're moving to this democratization of information. And I've been in this field for quite a while. Slightly embarrassing admission. Even when I was a kid, I used to have these little spy books, and I would see what everybody was doing in my neighborhood and log it down. I think that was a pretty good indication about my future career as an investigative journalist. And what I've seen from being in this access to information field for so long is that it used to be quite a niche interest. And it's gone mainstream. Everybody, increasingly around the world, wants to know about what people in power are doing. They want a say in decisions that are made in their name and with their money. It's this democratization of information that I think is an information enlightenment. And it has many of the same principles of the first enlightenment. It's about searching for the truth, not because somebody says it's true, because I say so. No, it's about trying to find the truth based on what you can see and what can be tested. That, in the first Enlightenment, led to questions about the right of kings, the divine right of kings to rule over people, or that women should be subordinate to men, or that the church was the official word of God. Obviously, the church weren't very happy about this, and they tried to suppress it. But what they hadn't counted on was technology. And then they had the printing press, which suddenly enabled these ideas to spread cheaply, far and fast. And people would come together in coffee houses, discuss the ideas, plot revolution, maybe a bit like the TED coffee house downstairs. Who knows what's going on down there today? In our day, we have digitization. That strips all the physical mass out of information. So now it's almost zero cost to copy and share information. Our printing press is the internet. Our coffee houses are social networks. We're moving to what I would think of as a fully connected system. And we have global decisions to make in this system. Decisions about climate, about finance systems, about resources. And think about it. If we want to make an important decision about buying a house, we don't just go off. I mean, I don't know about you, but I want to see a lot of houses before I put that much money into it. And if we're thinking about a finance system, we need a lot of information to take in. It's just not possible for one person to take in the amount, the volume of information, and analyze it to make good decisions. So that's why we're seeing increasingly this demand for access to information. That's why we're starting to see more disclosure laws come out. So for example, in the environment, there's the Aarhus Convention, which is a European directive that gives people a very strong right to know. So if your water company is dumping water into your river, sewage water into your river, you have a right to know about it. In the finance industry, you now have more of a right to know about what's going on. So we have different anti-bribery laws, money regulations, increased corporate disclosure. So you can now track assets across borders. And it's getting harder to hide assets, tax avoidance, pay inequality. So that's great. We're starting to find out more and more about these systems. And they're all moving to this central system, this fully connected system. Well, all of them except one. Can you guess which one? It's the system which underpins all these other systems. It's the system by which we organize and exercise power. And there I'm talking about politics. Because in politics, we're back to this system, this top-down hierarchy. And how is it possible that the volume of information can be processed that needs to in this system? Well, it just can't. That's it. And I think this is largely what's behind the crisis of legitimacy in our different governments right now. So I've told you a bit about what I did to try and drag Parliament kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what a few other people I know are doing in this field. So this is a guy called Seb Bacon. He's a computer programmer. And he built a site called Alivatelli. And what it is, it's a freedom of information platform. It's open source with documentation, and it allows you to make a freedom of information request to ask your public body a question. So you just go on there. It takes all the hassle out of it. And I can tell you that there is a lot of hassle making these requests. So it takes all of that hassle out, and you just type in your question, for example, how many police officers have a criminal record? It zooms it off to the appropriate person. It tells you when the time limit is coming to an end. It keeps track of all the correspondence. It posts it up there, and it becomes an archive of public knowledge. So that's open source, and it can be used in any country where there is some kind of freedom of information law. So there's a list there on the left of the different countries that have it, and then there's a few more coming on board. So if any of you out there like the sound of that and have a law like that in your country, I know that Seb would love to hear from you about collaborating and getting that into your country. This is Birgitta Jonsdottir. She's an Icelandic MP, and quite an unusual MP. In Iceland, she was one of the protesters who was outside of Parliament when the country's economy collapsed. And then she was elected on a reform mandate. And she's now spearheading this project. It's the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative. And they've just got funding to make it an international modern media project. And this is taking all of the best laws around the world about freedom of expression, protection of whistleblowers, protection from libel, source protection, and trying to make Iceland a publishing haven. It's a place where your data can be free. So when we think about increasingly how governments want to access user data, what they're trying to do in Iceland is make this safe haven where it can happen. In my own field of investigative journalism, we're also having to start thinking globally. So this is a site called Investigative Dashboard. And if you're trying to track a dictator's asset, for example, Hosni Mubarak, he's just funneling out cash from his country when he knows he's in trouble. And what you want to do to investigate that is you need to have access to all of the world's, as many as you can, companies' house registrations databases. So this is a website that tries to agglomerate all of those databases into one place so you can start searching for his relatives, his friends, the head of his security services. You can try and find out how he's moving out assets from that country. But again, when it comes to the decisions which are impacting us the most, perhaps, the most important decisions that are being made about war and so forth, again, we can't just make a freedom of information request. It's really difficult. So we're still having to rely on illegitimate ways of getting information through leaks. So when The Guardian did this investigation about the Afghan war, they can't walk into the Department of Defense and ask for all the information. They're just not going to get it. So this is This came from leaks of several tens of thousands of dispatches that were written by American soldiers and about the Afghan war and leaked, and then they're able to do this investigation. Another rather large investigation is around world diplomacy. Again, this is all based around leaks, 251,000 US diplomatic cables. And I was involved in this investigation because I got this leak through a leak from a disgruntled WikiLeaker and ended up going to work at The Guardian. So I can tell you firsthand what it was like to have access to this leak. It was amazing. I mean, it was amazing. It reminded me of that scene in The Wizard of Oz. Do you know the one I mean, where the little dog Toto runs across to where the wizard, and he pulls back, the dog's pulling back the curtain, and don't look behind the screen, don't look at the man behind the screen. It was just like that, because what you started to see is that all these grand statesmen, these very pompous politicians, they were just like us. They all bitched about each other. I mean, and really quite gossipy, those cables. But beyond that trivia, but I thought it was a very important point for all of us to grasp. These are human beings just like us. They don't have special powers, they're not magic, they are not our parents. Beyond that, what I found most fascinating was the level of endemic corruption that I saw across all different countries, and particularly centered around the heart of power, around public officials who were embezzling the public's money for their own personal enrichment, and allowed to do that because of official secrecy. So I've mentioned WikiLeaks, and is that an example of radical openness? Because surely what could be more open than publishing all the material, because that is what Julian Assange did. He wasn't content with the way the newspapers published it to be safe and legal. He threw it all out there. That did end up with vulnerable people in Afghanistan being exposed. It also meant that the Belarusian dictator was given a handy list of all the pro-democracy campaigners in that country who had spoken to the US government. Is that radical openness? I say it's not, because for me, what it means, it doesn't mean abdicating power, responsibility, accountability. It's actually being a partner with power. It's about sharing responsibility, sharing accountability. Also, the fact that he threatened to sue me because I got a leak of his leaks, I thought that showed a remarkable sort of inconsistency in ideology, to be honest, as well. The other thing is that power is incredibly seductive, and you must have two real qualities, I think, when you come to the table when you're dealing with power, talking about power, because of its seductive capacity. You've got to have skepticism and humility. Skepticism, because you must always be challenging. I want to see, why do you just say so? That's not good enough. I want to see the evidence behind why that's so. And humility, because we are all human. We all make mistakes. And if you don't have skepticism and humility, then it's a really short journey to go from reformer to autocrat. And I think you only have to read Animal Farm to get that message about how power corrupts people. So what is the solution? It is, I believe, to embody within the rule of law rights to information. At the moment, our rights are incredibly weak. In a lot of countries, we have Official Secrets Act, including in Britain here, we have an Official Secrets Act with no public interest test. So that means it's a crime. People are punished quite severely in a lot of cases for publishing or giving away official information. Now, wouldn't it be amazing, and really this is what I want all of you to think about, if we had an Official Disclosure Act where officials were punished if they were found to have suppressed or hidden information that was in the public interest. So that, yes, my power pose. I would like us to work towards that. So it's not all bad news. I mean, there definitely is progress on the line. But I think what we find is that the closer that we get right into the heart of power, the more opaque, closed it becomes. So it was only just the other week that I heard London's Metropolitan Police Commissioner talking about why the police need access to all of our communications spying on us without any judicial oversight. And he said the reason for that, it was a matter of life and death. He actually said that it was a matter of life and death. There was no evidence. He presented no evidence of that. It was just because I say so. You have to trust me. Take it on faith. Well, I'm sorry, people, but we are back to the pre-Enlightenment church. And we need to fight against that. So he was talking about the law in Britain, which is the Communications Data Bill, an absolutely outrageous piece of legislation. In America, you have the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. You've got drones now be considered for domestic surveillance. You have the National Security Agency building the world's giantest spy center. Is that word giantest? It's just this, it's 5 times bigger than the US Capitol, in which they're going to intercept and analyze communications traffic and personal data to try and figure out who's the troublemaker in society. Well, to go back to our original story, the parents have panicked. They've locked all the doors. They've kitted out the house with CCTV cameras. They're watching all of us. They've dug a basement and they've built a spy center to try and run algorithms and figure out which ones of us are troublesome. And if any of us complain about that, we're arrested for terrorism. Well, is that a fairy tale or a living nightmare? Some fairy tales have happy endings, some don't. I think we've all read the Grimm's fairy tales, which are indeed very grim. But the world isn't a fairy tale, and it could be more brutal than we want to acknowledge. Equally, it could be better than we've been led to believe. But either way, we have to start seeing it exactly as it is, with all of its problems. Because it's only by seeing it with all of its problems that we'll be able to fix them and live in a world in which we can all be happily ever after. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Amazing. Good job. Thank you so much, Heather. Heather wasn't trying to scare you, but our next speaker might just inadvertently do so. Marc Goodman looks like a warm and cuddly guy, but about 15 minutes from now, you might have an entirely different set of adjectives to describe him. Ladies and gentlemen, Marc Goodman.
I study the future of crime and terrorism. And frankly, I'm afraid. I'm afraid by what I see. I sincerely want to believe that technology can bring us the techno-utopia that we've been promised. But you see, I've spent a career in law enforcement, and that's informed my perspective on things. I've been a street police officer, an undercover investigator, a counterterrorism strategist, and I've worked in more than 70 countries around the world. And I've had to see more than my fair share of violence and the darker underbelly of society. And that's informed my opinions. My work with criminals and terrorists has actually been highly educational. They have taught me a lot. And I'd like to be able to share some of these observations with you. Today I'm going to show you the flip side of all those technologies that we marvel at, the ones that we love. In the hands of the TED community, these are awesome tools which will bring about radical openness and great change for our world. But in the hands of suicide bombers, the future can look quite different. I started observing technology and how criminals were using it as a young patrol officer. In those days, this was the height of technology. Laugh though you will, all the drug dealers and gang members with whom I dealt had one of these long before any police officer I knew did. 20 years later, criminals are still using mobile phones, but they're also building their own mobile phone networks, like this one, which has been deployed in all 31 states of Mexico by the narcos. They have a national encrypted radio communications system. Think about that. think about the innovation that went into that. Think about the infrastructure to build it. And then think about this. Why can't I get a cell phone signal in San Francisco? How is this possible? It makes no sense. We consistently underestimate what criminals and terrorists can do. Technology has made our world increasingly open, and for the most part, that's great. But all of this openness may have unintended consequences. Consider the 2008 terrorist attack on Mumbai. The men that carried that attack out were armed with AK-47s, explosives, and hand grenades. They threw these hand grenades at innocent people as they sat eating in cafes and waited to catch trains on their way home from work. But heavy artillery is nothing new in terrorist operations. Guns and bombs are nothing new. What was different this time is the way that the terrorists use modern information communications technologies to locate additional victims and slaughter them. They were armed with mobile phones, they had Blackberries, they had access to satellite imagery, they had satellite phones, and they even had night vision goggles. But perhaps their greatest innovation was this. We've all seen pictures like this on television and in the news. This is an operations center, and the terrorists built their very own ops center across the border in Pakistan, where they monitored the BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, and Indian local stations. They also monitored the internet and social media to monitor the progress of their attacks and how many people they had killed. They did all of this in real time. The innovation of the Terrorist Operations Center gave terrorists unparalleled situational awareness and tactical advantage over the police and over the government. What did they do with this? They used it to great effect. At one point during the 60-hour siege, the terrorists were going room to room trying to find additional victims. They came upon a suite on the top floor of the hotel, and they kicked down the door, and they found a man hiding by his bed. And they said to him, "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" And the man replied, "I'm just an innocent school teacher." Of course, the terrorists knew that no Indian school teacher stays at a suite in the Taj. They picked up his identification, and they phoned his name in to the terrorist war room, where the terrorist war room Googled him and found a picture and called their operatives on the ground and said, "Your hostage, is he heavyset? Is he bald in front? Does he wear glasses?" Yes, 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 came the answers. The ops center had found him, and they had a match. He was not a school teacher. He was the second wealthiest businessman in India. And after discovering this information, the terrorist war room gave the order to the terrorists on the ground in Mumbai. We all worry about our privacy settings on Facebook. But the fact of the matter is, our openness can be used against us. Terrorists are doing this. A search engine can determine who shall live and who shall die. This is the world that we live in. During the Mumbai siege, terrorists were so dependent on technology that several witnesses reported that as the terrorists were shooting hostages with one hand, they were checking their mobile phone messages in the very other hand. That's how integrated it was. In the end, 300 people were gravely wounded, and over 172 men, women, and children lost their lives that day. Think about what happened. During this 60-hour siege on Mumbai, 10 men, armed not just with weapons, but with technology, were able to bring a city of 20 million people to a standstill. 10 people brought 20 million people to a standstill, and this traveled around the world. This is what radicals can do with openness. This was done nearly 4 years ago. What could terrorists do today with the technologies available that we have? What will they do tomorrow? The ability of one to affect many is scaling exponentially. and it's scaling for good, and it's scaling for evil. It's not just about terrorism, though. There's also been a big paradigm shift in crime. You see, you can now commit more crime as well. In the old days, it was a knife and a gun. Then criminals moved to robbing trains. You could rob 200 people on a train, a great innovation. Moving forward, the internet allowed things to scale even more. In fact, many of you will remember the recent Sony PlayStation hack. In that incident, over 100 million people were robbed. Think about that. When in the history of humanity has it ever been possible for one person to rob 100 million? Of course, it's not just about stealing things. There are other avenues of technology that criminals can exploit. Many of you will remember this super cute video from the last TED. But not all quadcopter swarms are so nice and cute. They don't all have drumsticks. Some can be armed with HD cameras and do counter surveillance on protesters. Or, as in this little bit of movie magic, quadcopters can be loaded with firearms and automatic weapons. Little robots are cute when they play music to you. When they swarm and chase you down the block to shoot you, a little bit less so. Of course, criminals and terrorists weren't the first to give guns to robots. We know where that started. But they're adapting quickly. Recently, the FBI arrested a man, an Al-Qaeda affiliate in the United States, who was planning on using these remote-controlled drone aircraft to fly C4 explosives into government buildings in the United States. By the way, these travel at over 600 miles an hour. Every time a new technology is being introduced, criminals are there to exploit it. We've all seen 3D printers. We know with them that you can print in many materials, ranging from plastic to chocolate to metal and even concrete. With great precision. I actually was able to make this just the other day, a very cute little ducky. But I wonder to myself, for those people that strap bombs to their chests and blow themselves up, how might they use 3D printers? Perhaps like this. You see, if you can print in metal, you can print one of these. And in fact, you can also print one of these too. The UK, I know, has some very strict firearms laws. You needn't bring the gun into the UK anymore. You just bring the 3D printer and print the gun while you're here. And of course, the magazines for your bullets. But as these get bigger in the future, what other items will you be able to print? The technologies are allowing bigger printers. As we move forward, we'll see new technologies also, like the Internet of Things. Every day, we're connecting more and more of our lives to the internet, which means that the Internet of Things will soon be the Internet of Things to be hacked. All of the physical objects in our space are being transformed into information technologies, and that has a radical implication for our security, because more connections to more devices means more vulnerabilities. Criminals understand this, terrorists understand this, hackers understand this. If you control the code, you control the world. This is the future that awaits us. There has not yet been an operating system or a technology that hasn't been hacked. That's troubling, since the human body itself is now becoming an information technology. As we've seen here, we're transforming ourselves into cyborgs. Every year, thousands of cochlear implants, diabetic pumps, pacemakers, and defibrillators are being implanted in people. In the United States, there are 60,000 people who have a pacemaker that connects to the internet. The defibrillators allow a physician at a distance to give a shock to a heart in case a patient needs it. But if you don't need it and somebody else gives you the shock, it's not a good thing. Of course, we're going to go even deeper than the human body. We're going down to the cellular level these days. Up until this point, all the technologies I've been talking about have been silicon-based, ones and zeros. But there's another operating system out there, the original operating system, DNA. And to hackers, DNA is just another operating system waiting to be hacked. It's a great challenge for them. There are people already working on hacking the software of life. And while most of them are doing this to great good and to help us all, some won't be. So how will criminals abuse this? Well, with synthetic biology, you can do some pretty neat things. For example, I predict that we will move away from a plant-based narcotics world to a synthetic one. Why do you need the plants anymore? You can just take the DNA code from marijuana or poppies or coca leaves and cut and paste that gene and put it into yeast. And you can take those yeast and make the cocaine for you, or the marijuana, or any other drug. So how we use yeast in the future is going to be really interesting. In fact, we may have some really interesting bread and beer as we go into this next century. The cost of sequencing the human genome is dropping precipitously. It was proceeding at Moore's Law pace, but then in 2008, something changed. The technologies got better, and now DNA sequencing is proceeding at a pace 5 times that of Moore's Law. That has significant implications for us. It took us 30 years to get from the introduction of the personal computer to the level of cybercrime we have today. But looking at how biology is proceeding so rapidly, and knowing criminals and terrorists as I do, we may get there a lot faster with biocrime in the future. It'll be easy for anybody to go ahead and print their own biovirus, enhanced versions of Ebola or anthrax, weaponized flu. We recently saw a case where some researchers made the H5N1 avian influenza virus more potent. It already has a 70% mortality rate if you get it, but it's hard to get. Engineers, by moving around a small number of genetic changes, were able to weaponize it and make it much more easy for human beings to catch, so that not thousands of people would die, but tens of millions. You see, you can go ahead and create new pandemics. And the researchers who did this were so proud of their accomplishments, they wanted to publish it openly so that everybody could see this and get access to this information. But it goes deeper than that. DNA researcher Andrew Hessel has pointed out quite rightly that if you can use cancer treatments, modern cancer treatments, to go after one cell while leaving all the other cells around it intact, then you can also go after any one person's cell. Personalized cancer treatments are the flip side of personalized bioweapons, which means you can attack any one individual, including all the people in this picture. How will we protect them in the future? What to do? What to do about all this? That's what I get asked all the time. For those of you who follow me on Twitter, I will be tweeting out the answer later on today. Actually, it's a bit more complex than that, and there are no magic bullets. I don't have all the answers, but I know a few things. In the wake of 9/11, the best security minds put together all their innovation, and this is what they created for security. This was their thought of what the best and brightest in security looks like. If you're expecting the people who built this to protect you from the coming robo-apocalypse, you may want to have a backup plan. Just saying. Just think about that. Law enforcement is currently a closed system. It's nation-based, while the threat is national or international. Policing doesn't scale globally, at least it hasn't. And our current system of guns, border guards, big gates, and fences are outdated in the new world into which we're moving. So how might we prepare for some of these specific threats, like attacking a president or a prime minister? This would be the natural government response, to hide away all our government leaders in hermetically sealed bubbles. But this is not going to work. The cost of doing a DNA sequence is going to be trivial. Anybody will have it, and we will all have them in the future. So maybe there's a more radical way that we can look at this. What happens if we were to take the president's DNA, or a king or queen's, and put it out to a group of a few hundred trusted researchers so they could study that DNA and do penetration testing against it as a means of helping our leaders? Or what if we sent it out to a few thousand? Or controversially, and not without its risks, What happens if we just gave it to the whole public? Then we could all be engaged in helping. We've already seen examples of this working well. The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project is staffed by journalists and citizens, where they are crowdsourcing what dictators and terrorists are doing with public funds around the world. And in a more dramatic case, we've seen in Mexico, a country that has been racked by 50,000 narcotics-related murders in the past 6 years. They're killing so many people they can't even afford to bury them all in anything but these unmarked graves, like this one outside of Ciudad Juarez. What can we do about this? The government has proven ineffective. So in Mexico, citizens at great risk to themselves are fighting back to build an effective solution. They're crowd mapping the activities of the drug dealers. Whether or not you realize it, we are at the dawn of a technological arms race. An arms race between people who are using technology for good and those who are using it for ill. The threat is serious, and the time to prepare for it is now. I can assure you that the terrorists and criminals are. My personal belief is that rather than having a small elite force of highly trained government agents here to protect us all, we're much better off having average and ordinary citizens like ourselves approaching this problem as a group and seeing what we can do. If we all do our part, I think we'll be in a much better space. The tools to change the world are in everybody's hands. How we use them is not just up to me, it's up to all of us. This was a technology I would frequently deploy as a police officer. This technology has become outdated in our current world. It doesn't scale, it doesn't work globally, and it surely doesn't work virtually. We've seen paradigm shifts in crime and terrorism. They call for a shift to a more open form and a more participatory form of law enforcement. So I invite you to join me. After all, public safety is too important to leave to the professionals. Thank you.
We're all going to sleep better at night knowing that Marc Goodman is on the beat. By now, I think we all appreciate that you can't decide whether or not transparency or openness is virtuous until you know the consequences. And so we're asking very hard questions about the hidden design of our architecture, our cities, our politics, our society. As head of the London's Design Museum, there's no better person to help us answer those questions than Deyan Sudjic.
Wasn't Marc brilliant? But whether he was talking about the upside of transparency or not, I'm not sure. And being from the design world, I'm also going to ask some questions about it. You may have noticed by now that designers have a tendency to try to answer the question that they haven't been asked and to avoid answering the question that they have been asked. It's something I first noticed when, in the early days of Norman Foster, the architect of this remarkably transparent building, which is behind me, in Ipswich, he began his career by, when he was asked by potential clients to design them a factory or a warehouse, he had this habit of saying, no, you don't actually need a new building, just reorganize what you've got already. So, not that I'm saying I'm following in Norman's footsteps, but I am asking a few questions about what transparency means, and are there other things that one might think about? Opacity, for example. Transparency is one of those motherhood and apple pie kinds of words. How can we possibly object to it? It's about openness, democracy, clarity, shining light on dark spaces. And yet, we forget that when you actually look at a transparent glass wall, what you see in daylight is a reflection of yourself. When you look at this exquisite, when it was completed airport, again designed by Norman Foster, which was meant to be about the perfect space which would soothe travelers on their way to their aircraft, they could see the entrance, they could walk their way through this sunlit interior, they could see their aircraft and casually, relaxedly walk onto it. Well, it was like that when it opened, but since air travel has now started to adopt the agricultural methods of handling its passengers, it's turned into the third circle of hell. Here is transparency in its most political sense. The German Reichstag, rebuilt again by Norman Foster to mark German reunification, the symbolic heart of a reunited country, one which uses transparency in the most clearly symbolic way. There's its glass dome on top of the building, which the German electorate can spiral up to the top of, walking on top of their elected members and look down on their heads, except they can't anymore because it's become such a highly charged symbol that security limits access to the top of that building. Transparency, the symbolism of transparency is a very two-edged sword. Let's think about the design of currency, which you could understand as being the ultimate designer conjuring trick. A designer is called upon to make a worthless rectangle of paper worth something in a specifically British or American or European way. And let's think about the euro for a moment. Clearly, it was designed by someone who believed in the ideas of transparency and openness, in that if you examine each of the notes, they have on them a bridge, a door, and a window. But a non-specific bridge, door, and a window because they don't want to offend any particular nation state, so we don't know where they come from. But if you look very carefully, you see that they were designed by someone who believed in progress. Think about it. The low-value notes are decorated with Greek or ancient Roman windows, doors, and bridges, and they work their way through the Romanesque, to the Gothic, to the Baroque, and finally the high-value notes are plate glass and suspension bridges, a currency which says there is a future which we need to look forward to. Transparency, I don't know. I want to talk today a little bit about the virtues of opacity. Opacity, I think, is a quality which reflects some of the key things about modern life, some of the ways in which the ways that we live and that we work can have a sense of possibility and creativity. To me, opacity is a beautiful quality about shadows and about ambiguity, which allow a sense of possibility. It's the enemy of the two strands which are now looking for openness now, both from the authoritarian who want to know what we're doing, who want to disparage and overcome that sense of opacity, and some of those who believe in radical information availability, which can also become a way of spying on all of us. So let's look at the qualities of opacity, a number of scales, and I want to look at it both at the national scale, the urban, the corporate, and finally that of the individual object. You could say that this is the seat of power of a country which is clothed in opacity. On a symbolic level, this is an 18th century London townhouse of no particular quality when it was built, which looked like everything else in the same street. So here is power hidden away in what appears to be a domestic house. You could say it's the architectural equivalent of talking quietly and carrying a big stick. Here is the seat of power of modern Scotland, which one could say is a building which expresses all the joys and the agonies of small nations around the world. Scotland is a country of 5 million people in which everyone knows at least one person who was at school with the First Minister, and everyone thinks they could be the First Minister, but not everyone can be the First Minister, and the fact that everyone knows everybody else doesn't mean they necessarily like them. Looking at the architectural scale, this, of course, is the triumph of transparency in architecture of the high-tech moment. It's the Pompidou Center in Paris. It was built by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. And one can say this is modernity trying to use transparency as an alibi to smuggle ornament into the contemporary world, because modernity on one level finds it itself very uncomfortable with the idea of decoration. So here are the pipes left exposed, and they're color-coded. Blue is for water, yellow is for electricity. They're the standard color codings of the engineer. There's no functional reason to do that. They might as well be painted pink or have clouds decorating them. But here is the alibi for ornament and decoration. This is the summit of transparency for architecture. Another approach would be to say that the most successful contemporary art gallery in the world in terms of numbers, the Tate Modern, former power station on the river in London, reflects to me a sense of opacity. It's a building which has had more than one meaning in the course of its life. It doesn't necessarily show what it is, it allows the sense of discovery inside. Opacity allows things to happen. Transparency might be more difficult to allow things to happen with. For me, a city is not a work of art. Paris is a beautiful city, but one could say also a city which is less about opacity and more about order and control and the beauty of its objects. We know that it was built by Haussmann with the boulevards cut through to make crowd control more convenient. It's a beautiful city, and yet it's one in which creativity is leaking out. It's a city which banishes a very large proportion of its citizens. 8 million people live beyond the periphery. The center is for the privileged and beautiful, but in some ways a dying city. You could say that Brasilia is another form of that sense of city, a city which is a perfectly designed object, and yet it's a city which all the legislators who can leave at weekends to go and spend their weekends in Sao Paulo or Rio. To me, a successful city is one which allows possibilities. It's not, this is an image of poverty confronting affluence. In the distance, you can see some of those high-rises actually have swimming pools wrapped around the terraces as they rise to the top, looking down over a slum, a favela, in which there is very little running water. And yet, the qualities of urbanity that attract people from the poor south or from the periphery to come to a city are those qualities which are about the potential of a city in which to make your own life, to choose from it what you need, to ignore the bits that you don't need, to create your life within this soup of urbanity, the messy vitality of a city which is opaque rather than transparent. I'd like to compare two corporations as well now to show how transparency and opacity affect the way that companies work. The comparison here is between Olivetti, a company which appears to be about opacity, but actually was very transparent, and Apple, which appears to be transparent, which is actually deeply opaque. This is a street in Milan, the Corso Venezia, where for about 20 years, Olivetti, once one of the most innovative technology companies in the world, maintained its design studio, an invisible design studio in which it had extraordinarily liberal regime for its chief designers, Ettore Sottsass and Mario Bellini. They were allowed to maintain their own individual studio and work outside the company, and also work within the company for their projects. And from that space, they produced such extraordinary objects as the Valentine typewriter, designed by Ettore Sottsass back in the early 70s, which, in some ways, paralleling the Apple story, was a design transforming a company known for making business equipment into making something which was in its own day an essential consumer must-have object. Sottsass actually described this as the typewriter designed to keep poets company on lonely weekends in the countryside, suggesting that design is more about storytelling sometimes than form-making. Compare this to the operations of Apple at One Infinite Loop, an address which tells you almost all that you need to know about it, which is, of course, a utopian workplace in which Jonathan Ive, one of the most successful designers of his generation, has an extraordinary amount of autonomy and a chance to make seriously important objects. And yet sometimes one feels that One Infinite Loop is a place which is like a nature reserve in which the last surviving thin people in California have been herded together for their own protection. And here is the new One Infinite Loop. It's Norman Foster's circular building, which is the kind of place where things like this, this is what was produced in the old One Infinite Loop, a transparent object. It's a company which, on the one hand, seems much less appealing than Olivetti with its generations of history of culture and doing social projects within Italy, and yet Olivetti is the company which could not make the transition from the mechanical age to the digital one, and Apple is now one of the most wealthy companies on the planet. My last thoughts really are about the ways in which the analog and the digital transformation have transformed what design is. I show the Polaroid SX70 as the poignant high watermark of the analog world for photography. You'd have to say that analog is transparent, digital is opaque, because for the designer, the analog world gives you something to gives you a starting point for a design. It has mechanical parts, it shows you what an object does, and yet the Polaroid SX70, through a remarkable combination of technology and design, was a machine which came as close as the analog world ever could to the weightlessness and the shiny sheen of the digital moment. This was the camera which, if you press the button, out would pop a square rectangle of photographic paper, which, with that satisfying whoosh, would actually encourage you to press it again and again and again. And you could watch, with the slowness of the Turin shroud, the image take shape on that glossy rectangle of paper in front of you. An irresistible object, and yet one which now belongs to the age of mass extinctions of once promising analog technology. We are now in a moment in which we are in the digital world, where the designer is working with a sense of opacity. It's not what a digital object looks like, it's not what it feels like, it's what's inside it that really counts. And that is a very different form of design for me. So to go back to the question that I didn't answer at the beginning about opacity and transparency, I love transparent buildings. I adore the Pompidou Center. I love my Polaroid SX70. But if we are to live in a world in which we can continue to encourage innovation, to be creative, we need the opacity, the messy vitality of a city which is not transparent. Thank you. Thank you.